Hey everybody, and welcome to week 4 of class. First and foremost, you have to forgive me for my less than professional attire here, so hopefully you can forgive me for that. But this week is our very last week of content, and we have a lot of history to cover, a lot of topics and themes to address during this week. As always, we're trying to get a lot done in a short amount of space, so just bear with me as we really try to cram into 1 week about 50 or so plus years of history. So where we're going to begin this week is in the 1950s, and we are going a little bit back on the timeline, if you will, from last week to take a look at the decade of the 1950s, which is a very interesting and unique decade. In many ways, when we think about the 1950s, a lot of folks, I say we, but a lot of folks think very nostalgically about the 1950s, as though it was a time of kind of great prosperity, a time of moral greatness. And in fact, there's a lot of people that refer to this time as if we could just go back to and what they really mean is the values of the 1950s were the last time in American history when the values were good. Family values were strong, morality was strong. And in some ways, this is really an inaccurate image. There is some historical amnesia that's going on because a lot of what happened in the 1950s was somewhat unique. And many of the ideas about the 1950s as being kind of this fantastic moment for people where the family was strong and Christian values were strong and the institutions of America were strong, those ideas were true for a certain demographic of American society, and largely it had to be for white middle-class Americans who had access to better paying jobs, who had access to better educational facilities, who had access to housing benefits and even GI Bill benefits. If you were African American, for example, the 1950s probably would not have been necessarily an ideal moment for you as you were living in segregation, where there was white flight going on from the cities into the suburban areas. And so when we think about the 1950s, although we might want to be nostalgic about it, we have to recognize that there's a lot going on. I mean, during the 1950s, although we're not going to look at it necessarily in this particular section when we talk about the 1950s, but during that time you've got the origins of the civil rights movement, you've got communism and the fear of communism, and there's people building bomb shelters in their houses, and there's just a great deal of fear and anxiety that resides in the United States during the 1950s. But with that said, there are some things about that nostalgic past that we do need to deal with, and one is the development of suburban housing. The kind of pioneer of suburban living would have been William Levitt. There was a great need for housing, and apartment buildings simply were not going to solve the problem. And people really didn't want to live in apartment buildings, at least white Americans didn't. And in fact, many different demographics didn't want to, but one of the things that you'll see is that if you were African American, you were going to find a very difficult time to move into suburbia because there was restrictions where folks simply wouldn't sell houses to black people. But there's a boom in suburban living. William Levitt begins this process of building kind of cookie cutter single family homes in New York, and that will continue to boom in a number of different areas. There's also a boom in the economy. The economy becomes just out of this world during the 1950s. You've got a growth in the GDP. You've got a development going on in the United States where the United States is becoming a consumer society. That is, they're buying goods and they're purchasing goods for their families. The home itself, the suburban homes, become the centers of kind of child rearing, and the child sort of becomes the center of suburban life. Okay, it is during this time that you see a boom in the youth culture, rock and roll music, and a whole range of ideas that teens are real people and they can be treated like real people. I mean, that idea sounds a little ridiculous today, but that notion of kids having identity and expendable income to spend on things like transistor radios was very powerful during the 1950s. During the 1950s, you definitely have a society that is very homogenous. People generally looked and acted very much the same, but there were a group of people within that demographic who sort of fought against that. This group would be called the beatnik culture, or the Beats. They are kind of the forerunners to the counterculture of the 1960s, or more popularly known as the hippies. and they were basically discontent with a homogenized society where basically they got up, went to work, and they bought things, and they became consumers, and they didn't want that for themselves, okay? There's a lot that we're going to talk about during the 1950s, but that kind of gives you just a very brief sort of overview of the so many things that happened. And indeed, the 1950s really continues to live on in popular memory because of the TV shows that are even to this day still shown, like I Love Lucy and Leave It to Beaver, where they sort of forward this sort of ideal about what the United States was going to be and what it was and what we might want it to be. And so that kind of history lives on in those forms of popular culture. And indeed, the television was really the purveyor of popular culture and popular form during that time. It's one of the reasons, for example, why advertising becomes such a major thing and an industry in and of itself during the 1950s, because more and more people are beginning to watch TV in their homes. So we've got the 1950s. Now, during the 1950s, one of the things that's going to happen is the roots of the civil rights movement are going to explode. And just be aware that although our focus is going to be on African Americans and their experience in the civil rights movement, there are a range of different folks who are fighting for equality. You can take a look at Occupy Alcatraz and that incident and recognize, the Native Americans are still dealing with issues with the United States. You have Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and the Delano grape strike with the Filipinos and the Mexicans coming together to strike for better working conditions. You've got second wave feminism and the women's movement, which was sort of exploded upon the scene by the publication of the Femme Mystique written by Betty Friedan. You've got the LGBT community that explodes on the scene, where after the Stonewall riot in New York, the gay rights movement begins to become a thing. And in San Francisco, you can see that gay pride parades explode on the scene in the 1970s, 1980s. One of the things, unfortunately, that's going to happen in the LGBT community is going to get a lot of probably undue backlash, but there's going to be an AIDS epidemic that slams into the United States in the 1980s. And there's a lot of folks who said that this was God's judgment upon the gay community, that their actions were sinful somehow, and that God was going to destroy them in this way. But there are a number of movements going on. We're just going to really focus on the African American movement because that's really what the civil rights movement was really focused on. And in some ways, there's sort of two waves of the civil rights movement. One, which is the longer phase, really attempted to address issues of equal access to public spaces. Okay, there's a move towards desegregation, whether that's going to be in the schools, whether that's going to be on the buses, whether that's going to be in restaurants or in parks. There's going to be a move to get those areas desegregated. And kind of, I guess, the spokesperson of that movement would be Martin Luther King Jr., who forwarded a tactic of nonviolence. Right? That, something like, we're going to have a sit-in at the restaurant and demand to be served. And if they don't serve us and they beat us up and they throw us out, we will simply be nonviolent and we will take it. Right? This really comes to a head in Birmingham in 1963 when on a second day of a protest rally, fire hoses are brought out to shoot people down, attack dogs are brought out to attack people, people are being beaten and arrested, and all this is being televised, and nonviolence is what folks are watching on TV. At least the response of the African American community is nonviolence. And in the end, there are some landmark pieces of legislation which attempt to try and address public spaces and equal access, right? We can see Brown v. Board of Education try to desegregate the schools. It didn't always work out so well, but it was there. And then later on, you get the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 64 and 65. Now, there are a segment of the African American community who begins to believe that the nonviolent strategies of Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian community and SNCC, among others, that is not solving the problems, right? Indeed, desegregation does not necessarily result in better hiring practices. It doesn't necessarily result in better access to housing and education and home loans and mortgages and all of those things. And so what you begin to see is a movement away from nonviolence towards a more militant movement, which is kind of illustrated in the phrase Black Power. And you're going to see folks like Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, Huey Newton, and the Black Panthers, the rise of the Black Panthers out of Oakland in 1966. And they begin to go, as the Black Panthers would say, by way of the gun, using more militant, violent strategies to try and address the inequality that African Americans saw. And so those are just two strategies that you might want to be aware of. Obviously, we're going to be talking about specific examples where you're going to see the civil rights movement kind of explode. That obviously would be, you know, the bus boycott after Rosa Parks. You're going to have the I Have a Dream speech and the March on Washington, among a bunch of other things. So we're going to be looking at that. And then what we're going to be doing after that is looking at more contemporary history, which I know sounds a bit strange, but after the 1970s, really historians have not found a really great way to look at history thematically. So we kind of do it by presidents. And so really what we're going to be looking at is Presidents Nixon through Obama. I am not going to deal with Donald Trump. He's still a sitting president. And I'm not going to try to assess a sitting president. In fact, to even try to assess the presidency of Barack Obama and even George Bush, we're still a little too close to those events to really fully assess and understand what happened. But we're going to be looking at a number of different events this week. So, for example, under the presidency of Ronald Reagan, there was a great deal of things that were going on. The Cold War was going on. Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire. You've got homelessness, the AIDS epidemic, all going on during Reagan's administration. But one thing that he attempts to tackle is the slagging economy. There was the economy was not doing well during the Nixon, Ford, and Carter administrations, and so Reagan attempts to implement something known as supply-side economics or trickle-down economics. Also called Reaganomics or voodoo economics, depending on if you agreed with him or not. But basically the idea that there's going to be tax breaks for the people at the top, and as these tax breaks happen, the benefits will trickle down. Did this work? Not initially, but by 1983, 1984, you definitely do find the economy is beginning to get better. During the next president, George Bush, the first, George Herbert Walker Bush, you've got a conflict that goes on, the Gulf War. Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. And the reason why Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait is because he wanted access to sell oil, and there was competition going on between the Kuwait and himself, so he invades Kuwait. Under George Bush, he says, we're not going to do that. He brings the UN in. They kick Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. It's a very, very short war, the Persian Gulf War, but that goes on during Bush's administration. During his son's administration, of course, George Walker Bush, you've got the September 11th attacks by Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda means like the base is what their name means. But of course, the September 11 attacks, which will ultimately lead to America's war on terror. We will pass the Patriot Act, which, among other things, allowed for government agencies to be able to essentially spy on American citizens and others who they thought might be potential terrorists. And so you've got that going on. And then, of course, once we get to Barack Obama's administration, you know, he's going to come in and he's going to do a lot of different things. But perhaps the most significant thing that he does, of course, is it demonstrates a shift in American perspective, as he is the first African-American president. Now, I will say this, and it gets forgotten sometimes, but Barack Obama is half black, half white. And so he is what we call a mulatto. That's the term meant for a half black, half white individual. Not that that really matters. I think in the end, him taking the stage as president is an important historical event. So, all right, guys, I've gone on and on and on here. There's a lot to cover this week. So with that, I'm going to leave you there. Hopefully this will be helpful to you. Next week, you're going to have your final exam. Please make sure that you watch the short little video on that, because I explained a little bit about how your final exam is going to be organized. So, yeah, if you have questions or comments, please contact me and I'll get back to you. Otherwise, as always, go in peace, be warm and filled. May the force be with you. Live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor. Have a blessed week, guys.